Hey, welcome to this video about the futures market. Now, there's a lot of aspects of the futures market, lots of terms, lots of things to know. However, in the very beginning, we want to talk about the basic concept of the futures market. What is a futures contract and how did that come about? So in this presentation, you're going to learn a lot more about the specific parts of a futures contract, especially how it connects to trading in the futures market, the participants that buy and sell those, they're basically buyers and sellers, and so that's what this presentation focuses on. So take a look again at all the other resources, but this is the focus for this presentation: buyers, sellers, contracts, and the futures market. Take a look. These two participants in the market each have a different point of view. For example, buyers would love to have a low price, and sellers, well, they would like to have a high price. And so really you've got pretty much conflicting views. So how do they ever make a deal? So how does a deal ever get created? Well, there are other factors that go into an agreement, but somehow the buyers and the sellers have to both agree, and then you've got yourself a deal. All right, well, there's a lot of situations in the market where you have, for example, numbers of buyers coming to the market and they are greater than the sellers' numbers in the market. And so the result is what's going to happen is price is going to get bid up. And so as the number of buyers come in and there's fewer sellers, the price goes up. That's simple supply and demand. What about a situation where you have the number of buyers again and they are less than the number of sellers? And so you have a different outcome. You've got the price getting driven down. This cycle just continues to repeat over and over and over, and that is why we have markets where the prices go up and go down. So it can vary quite a bit. Not only do you have this situation, but you have regular old supply issues that come around. Plus, you not only have that, you have regular old demand issues that come around. And so these areas plus the areas above create this idea of price up and down. What do we call that? In our agricultural world, we call that risk. In fact, specifically, there are lots of risk areas, but this one we're talking about price risk. So that's kind of the focus of the class, is price analysis, and it really comes to do with price risk. So how do we manage this risk? Well, there's a couple of ways, but one of those ways directly relates to this concept of a contract. And so a contract is a risk tool, and so it helps us manage this risk. Well, a contract has four specific aspects. So what are the four aspects of every contract? Well, number one is we have to agree on a quantity. So once we agree on a quantity, then maybe we can continue to negotiate, and one of the other things might be quality. So how good is it and how much of it is? And so an example would be maybe a corn producer is going to be talking about bushels, or maybe we're talking about pounds, or maybe we're talking about tons. There's lots of ways we can identify quantity. Quality sometimes is identified as a grade, and so maybe they are number 2 yellow corn. Another thing on grade might be percent moisture if you're talking about a grain. So it may be beef cattle, it may be the grade of choice or select. So it may be its pounds or weight. There's lots of ways to identify this quality. So quantity and quality are the first two, and we got to negotiate that. What else do we need to negotiate? And that is time. So time might be the delivery month. It could even be location. But what's our time agreement? And so normally maybe that's a month. Maybe it's a day of the month. And so it could be lots of things to negotiate. So these are the first three aspects to negotiate. And finally, the last one, usually the one that gets talked about last, is the price. So what is it going to be? What's the amount of money? So these things are all part of what's called a contract. And a contract can kind of eliminate the situation. So what situation are we trying to eliminate? For example, today is going to be September. And in September today, we are a buyer of, let's just say corn is our product. So we're a buyer of corn. Today's September, but we actually need the corn in December. And so let's say we are a feed mill operation. And so in our mill, we actually are producing feed, and we're good with corn, but in December we need more. So what is our risk? Well, price risk, I guess I should say. Our price risk is the price from today to December might go up. So if we have an increase in price, then that's going to increase our cost, and then therefore that's going to decrease our, I'm going to use profit here. So that's going to drive our profits down. And so really this is our biggest concern. So how do we deal with that? Well, how do you manage that? And that is going to be an answer of, what if we just did a contract? So what if we found somebody that's willing to contract today for the price and delivery? So today is again September. And so we have this window of time to December. In our window of time, we're concerned about it. So instead of waiting the entire time, we can just add ourselves in a contract here. And then that way we would actually have a set deal. And this set deal would have to talk about the four things that we talked about before. We would have to negotiate quantity, quality, we would have to negotiate the time, and then finally the last one is of course the price. So this is a typical situation. It's no big deal to it at all. This is what happens. However, this is where the futures market comes in. So what the futures market did was the futures market came in and established these contract areas. They came in and said, you know what, if we had a particular group of individuals that wanted to buy and sell corn, what if we could bring them into one place? And that's called the futures market. Now, you've got other information this week about different markets and kind of the history of the futures market, but that was the history. It brought together these buyers and sellers that had a common goal to think about where we are today and what we're going to be in the future. And that question got answered through the futures market because they dealt with something called a contract. Now, not only did they deal with something called a contract, it became kind of a specific contract. And at first, and sometimes I say at first, the word forward contract was used. Forward, of course, meaning that it's not a contract of today, because that would just be a deal today. It's a contract in the future, and so it's called a futures contract. Well, these contracts began to get buyers and sellers that bought them. So if you were a buyer of a contract on, let's say, corn as an example, then you had what was called a buy position. You could also come in and not buy a contract. You could be a seller of a contract of corn, and actually you are referred to as a seller. And so the futures market is a collection of these participants, 1 and 2, that we talked about before, but everything's from a contract perspective. Now, the idea of these contracts are that that we end up with these two positions, and these contracts are going to be negotiated. And again, we're talking about a futures contract. And so that actually is really the creation of the market. The futures market is a collection of these participants, and they are identified with some terms. Now, sometimes it's hard to really remember, and it's longer to say a buyer of a contract or a buyer. So buyers of contracts have a buy position, but in the futures market, they're labeled as a long position. And so some terms start to come into play here. Now, a seller, their position is, of course, a sell, but that is called in the market a short position. And so these positions are really to try to help describe the position that someone has. And so really this is the first concept of an introduction to the futures market and these contracts and these 4 areas that exist of those contracts. All right, so we got other resources here, but mainly wanted to make sure that we had a good handle on what are the 4 aspects of a contract.